Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 202, January 20th to January 26th, 1864. Last week, we covered the attack and capture of Fort Fisher outside of Wilmington, North Carolina. There might have been a more concentrated defense of this vital work, protecting the mouth of the Cape Fear River, and subsequently Wilmington, the last port open to the Confederacy. As it was, though, after a brief and fierce assault, the work would fall, leading eventually to the fall of Wilmington itself in February. This week, I would like to go to some first-hand sources. We have talked about war correspondence before, but we have some correspondences reporting back on Updike's Ohio regiments recently having done a good job at Franklin and Nashville. We will also talk about what it is like to be in the South Carolina Brigade in the winter. Before we cover those things, though, we do need to talk about our Patreon content, and here in January, we have posted a movie review. We've done Gone with the Wind. It's one of the classics that we had not done yet for the Patreon. Talked a little bit about the movie, did a little review on it, the synopsis, and then, of course, we talked about the historical accuracy. So, if that sounds like it would interest you, we've done Gone with the Wind. Obviously, we've done other movies before. All the other classics, Glory, Gettysburg, amongst others. We've done memoir reviews, and there's also picture slideshows of the modern-day battlefields and what they look like. So, if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. Now, here we have some of these correspondences that have been put together. A compilation here. Updike's brigade has actually, in the writings here, has started to make their winter quarters at Huntsville, Alabama. So they just chased Hood out of Tennessee, right? We talked about Franklin and Nashville. Obviously, Franklin, that's where they do a good job. And Updike, of course, is a prickly personality. So it kind of works out, though, for the Union line. He's there at the right place, right time to stop any kind of breakthrough in the Union center. And then, obviously, we had the pseudo-siege of Nashville, not really a siege, that ends with Thomas destroying Hood twice, essentially doing the same thing twice, 2 separate days, completely breaks Hood's line. Confederates might have been able to put up a little bit more of a fight, obviously, had they done a better job of placing their works, especially on the second day, but really, morale is super low despite your invading force going into Tennessee, super low, so they're going to break under a determined Union assault. So here we have our accounts here from Updike's brigade. This is from February 12th, 1865. My dear Colonel, I'm glad to write you favorably from the brigade. Everything is moving with decorum. The weather, which was bad for a few days after you left, has cleared off, and the ground is now drying rapidly. Drills and parades will receive vigorous attention this week. Inspections were held today, Sunday, by regimental commanders, all which expressed themselves highly gratified with the result. The brigade was never better armed and equipped, and the soldiers never took more pride in their personal appearance than now. General Elliott visited us yesterday and rode through the camps. He was quite delighted, declaring that it was the best camp in the army. He intimated that General Stanley would probably visit soon. We shall not be taken by surprise. Such true soldiers as ours are bound to win praise where their valor and perseverance can command it. The sentinel duty is being performed better every day. It will soon be impossible to distinguish recruits from old soldiers. The brigade court-martial organized on last Friday. The business before it will probably be completed this week. Captain Barber and Lieutenant Griffin of the 88th Illinois, who were arrested for drunkenness, are summoned before a court-martial at Corps headquarters. There is no indication of move in the department. Many officers, including nearly all at Corps headquarters, have sent for their wives. General Elliott says we will have evidence that Hood's army has gone after Sherman, with the exception of one corps and a small body of cavalry. By order of General Thomas, Colonel Blake and the captain of the 2nd Brigade are to be dishonorably mustered out of the service for persisting in urging their resignations. Having influenced the men who enter the service with them to veteranize, they wish now to leave them to stick it out as best they can. No business letters have come up since he left. 4 letters have come from Mrs. Opdyke, but as is no part of her intention that you should read them at home, I will see the spirit of her intention executed. Colonel Stratton came to see you yesterday and was apparently disappointed to find you gone. From this conversation, I think he intends to quit the service soon. Colonel Russer has been to see me, says that the colonel we are getting are finally, and sends my regards. All of the staff wish to be kindly remembered. My love to Mrs. Opdyke, and my best respects to Harmon and Mr. Park. I am very respectfully your obedient servant, R.C. Powers. This is actually coming from his aide-de-camp, aide to Opdyke, who's gone home, obviously. And it kind of goes through some day-to-day experiences, right? This is not on the campaigning front, but we have, kind of the business of camp. They're about to make winter quarters. Some of the officers are bringing their families in, obviously, if you're winterizing. And at this point, really, the war in this section of the country is pretty much over, really. So you're going to have these kinds of instances where there are individuals who are going to be starting to leave the Army because the thing's going to be a foregone conclusion here, even though we're only in February. But, pretty much here coming up in April, the war is going to end. So here we have another one. And this is actually from a correspondent. I don't know of a better way of improving my time on this wet and rainy March day than in jotting down a few items concerning the 125th, hoping that it may not entirely fail to interest some of the many readers of that very highly prized Union sheet, the Cleveland Herald. Since about the 1st of November last until a few days ago, by being an intimate of the hospitals, sick and unable to follow the regiment, I am entitled to none of the honors subsequently attained in the will-be, if not already world-renowned, battles of Franklin and Nashville, in which the Union boys so successfully routed, whipped, and demoralized Hood's large army that was going to take Nashville, and then march through Kentucky and Ohio to the shores of Lake Erie. But Hood couldn't quite, at least didn't match, our invaluable and almost immortal Sherman, for he accomplished what he set out to do, which was no more nor less than marching his army through the very heart of Rebeldon and taking Savannah, one of their very important seacoast cities. Hood couldn't have been aware of the capabilities of the Union Army there assembled around Nashville, with the invulnerable Thomas at their head, or he never would have jeopardized his army by placing them in a battle array against such a formidable foe. Our present camp is situated some 2 miles from the pleasant and interesting town of Huntsville, Alabama, on a rolling piece of ground very suitable for a camp, and very convenient to those important necessities of an army, water and food. We are posed in the security of a camp guard, in addition to the regular line of pickets. As is usually the case in the Army, plenty of news is afloat after the grapevine order, among which the most prominent is the occupation of Richmond by Union troops. More anon. So there we have an account from a anonymous source here. They don't actually put their real name. A lot of these guys would have done some pen names, especially if you were revealing, information that, some officers probably wouldn't want to get out. Famously, Sherman doesn't like newspaper guys. Grant doesn't really like newspaper guys because they're constantly talking about what the Army is doing. And if you have these sources like this individual who might be on some general staff, then obviously that's going to be a problem if the newspaper is printing what you're going to do because they have a better idea than most. Also, you're going to see here that they're talking about the world-famous battles of Franklin and Nashville, and it might actually be a little bit of a joke here in that Franklin's kind of overlooked almost immediately. It's overlooked. It's a huge battle in that there was a lot of Confederate casualties. They're not so much in terms of Union casualties. It's not the largest battle, but it does have a 20,000 man assault by the Confederates. Hood is going to wreck any hope that he has of capturing Nashville, of actually accomplishing his plan. And so, they always have that goal of getting into Kentucky and hopefully raising an army there. There's a large portion of the population of Kentucky that doesn't enlist on either side as they kind of remain neutral. We talked about the neutrality back in the early part of these episodes, but they're always going to be wanting to take Kentucky and keep it for the Confederacy. It's just never going to go that way. So we have that as the plan after Nashville falls, apparently according to this source. And this is from March 1865. Among the incidents that break in upon the routine of camp life was one which transpired at headquarters this afternoon, and will never be forgotten by those who witnessed it. It served to turn the heart in upon itself and called forth the finest feelings of the soul. The 125th Regiment, having been provided with a new stand of colors by their friends in Ohio, had, by unanimous vote, determined to present their old battle-scarred and bullet-riddled flag to General Opdyke, their former colonel, the man under whose command they had won imperishable honor and who had so often led them to glorious victory. The regiment having been drawn up in front of the general's quarters, he was waited on by a committee of its officers, and the flag presented to him by Captain R.C. Powers in the following eloquent and touching language. General Opdyke, as an evidence of high esteem in which you are held by the officers and men in the 125th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, I have the honor of presenting you its flag. It is not on account of any temporal value that can be attached to it that has been deemed a fitting tribute of our respect. As an article of the merchandise, it changed its value when first it was accepted as a battle flag of the regiment. Since then, sacred associations have gathered around it, and which have endeared it to our hearts, and given to it worth which cannot be estimated in dollars and cents. It was while burning with resentment at the insult of traitors who ignored our birthright of freedom and ridiculed the principle of equality established by the blood of our fathers, upon which all our hopes of remaining a united and powerful nation were based, that we first took it up and marched into the field. In many bloody encounters, we have met the foe. If we have not always been fully victorious, we have at least never beat an inglorious retreat. The notable sentiment expressed by one of our officers in the midst of the conflict at Chickamauga has been our constant watchword. The enemy may outnumber us and kill us, but he can never whip us. Never. To you for organizing, developing, and directing this indomitable courage is due in a great degree the high honor which you have attained as a regiment. At Chickamauga, Missionary Ridge, Dandridge, Rocky Face, Resaca, New Hope Church, Kennesaw Mountain, Peachtree Creek, Atlanta, and Jonesboro, this flag has been unfurled in the face of the enemy, and each succeeding time it has come from the field with new laurels and increasing glory. A thing of beauty, we loved it when first we marshaled under its bright stars and stripes, because it represented the honor and power of our government. Now that its brightness has faded since some of its stars have fallen off, and its stripes have become almost obliterated by contact with the foe, it is unsuited longer to be carried into the fight, and deserved to be preserved as a sacred relic to be revered, not so much because it recalls our own sufferings, privations, and dangers, but because it is inseparably associated with the memory of our fallen comrades. To that memory, the deepest vibrations of our heart, sympathy, and love must ever respond. From Nashville to Chattanooga, from the mountain regions of East Tennessee to the plains of Middle Georgia, their graves are scattered, unmarked by any monumental marble. The frowning heights of Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain, the winding banks of Chickamauga and Chattahoochee rivers, and the rugged cliffs of Rocky Face shall be their eternal tombs. Attached to this is a list of their names. They number 187 brave men, our friends, our comrades, our brothers. They fell at our sides, and we missed them in the fight. On the march, their places have been vacant, and in camp and bivouac we have longed for them and wept. In this flag we behold the emblem of the devotion which their blood has sealed. And today these comrades, once so strong, so generous, so brave, but whose voices are now silent, and whose hearts thrill no more with martial ardor, join us in whispering from the grave and confiding to you its keeping. Take it, and as long as the stripe or star remains to reflect the light of heaven, may it be held sacred to the memory of the gallant dead, and be a proof of our strong confidence in your ardor, ability, and zeal in the defense of our common country and the cause of universal freedom. To the new banner that waves over our heads, we pledge the same devotion which it was our pride to bestow upon the old one. Although our numbers are few, our ranks much reduced by battle and disease, we are strong in heart, invincible in will, and our confidence in God defend the right can be diminished by no circumstance of time or place, defeat, or victory. So there we have an address from an officer in the 125th, and obviously it is very powerful in words, and I think it really does a good job to read this because we've talked before about how important these flags are. They're a piece of home, and they're a piece of the comrades in which are fighting and have fallen in the regiment. It may seem weird in the modern lens is that why is a flag so important? We have so many flags. Flags weren't mass produced at this time. Flags were important. They were handmade. They were coming from your hometown, or they obviously weren't a whole lot of them. So it is interesting to read this, and I think it's a good thing to point out here. Just why are these so important? Why do we talk about how many flags were captured on these different battles during these different assaults, and who lost their flag? Who's getting the flag? People are getting medals of honor because they are capturing a flag. And I think this passage in here, just reading through it, I think that really shows just why it's important. And we'll close out here with a little account from another correspondent here, the same correspondent we read earlier, who's anonymous. And this is coming from March 19th, 1865. Seated in the top bunk of our snug little shebang on this beautiful morning, I again take the pleasure of addressing the readers of the Herald and those interested in the welfare of the 125th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Today is Sunday, the day recognized and respected by everybody except the military portion of the world as a day of rest. But the soldier, as a general thing, looks upon Sunday as any other day. He is almost, if not altogether, obliged to respect it not, and would hardly know when it was Sunday if it wasn't for his memoranda, or the never-failing Sunday inspection, which for today is already past. From our window of 4 lights of glass, which is all probability helped to compose some Alabama planter's mansion, which now lights a soldier's rude shanty, and the distance can be seen a low range of mountains, at the present time undoubtedly the retreat of some roving guerrilla band. In the intervening space lies spread out to view a beautiful undulating country that in former years, before that desolating scourge of war, had made its withering and blighting inroads boast of its large cotton fields and tobacco plantations. Across the creek, where the camp guards are pacing their beat, on yonder rise of ground surrounded by old negro quarters and outhouses, stands a large southern mansion house, I suppose that's the name to call it, which at present is brigade headquarters and occupied by General Opdyke and staff. Yesterday, a number of us, First Lieutenant Stedman among the number, visited a cave situated in the vicinity of Huntsville, perhaps about 2 miles from town and a mile from our camp. Our entrance was made by descending a ladder of about 12 or 14 feet in length, and when I saw up at the top of the bottom rounds and clambering down a descent of about 50 feet of broken, sharp, and slippery rocks. Perspiring freely, we were at last gained the bottom with our candles, which we had previously lighted. Dimly glimmering in the gloomy darkness, we commenced exploring the interior of the rocky cavern of nature's own construction. After about an hour and a half or 2 hours picking our way amongst loose rocks and enormous boulders, we last became in a measure satisfied, and again sought the bounteous light of day, and the free air of heaven, which we gained in due time, all safe and sound, but puffing equal to a young 4-horse engine. But for the present, I must say, au revoir. So we'd have another depiction of, a non-combat scenario. At this point in your winter quarters and your more permanent quarters, especially if you're in Southern Territory, you're probably more worried about guerrillas, so there's a little kind of a account in there. It's kind of interesting how there is a culture shock as well, which is another reason why I read this particular passage, in that it's like, I don't really know what to call this mansion house, right? Like, I'm from Ohio. We don't have these things there. So there is a lot of different accounts that you read throughout the war where these northern soldiers are having these culture shocks when they come down. We talked about it when we were going over Sherman's March to the Sea. A lot of them actually turn into abolitionists on the march because they actually see firsthand what's going on and just how some of the conditions are less than ideal. How there are packs of dogs who are keeping these individuals in order, and they're actually killing human beings when they're supposedly, getting out of line, running away, what have you. So this is definitely another good example of that, just being where they were. Like, I'm sure there were a lot of great cotton fields there, tobacco, whatever. Here's a house, or whatever you call it, your plantation perhaps, right? So there's all these different cultures that are mixing as part of this conflict as well. So there we have a Union account. This is actually going to be about McGowan, South Carolina Brigade here, and we will talk about it. There's a writing here about the condition of the brigade during the winter of 64 into 65. So we've read the 1865 correspondences of the 125th Ohio and subsequently Opdyke's brigade, and now here we have a South Carolina regiment in the Army of Northern Virginia. Hitherto, I have deemed it a sufficient description of the brigade to rate its achievements in battle and its suffering on the march and in camp, without comment on them, without reference to the Confederacy at large, and with only such mention of the truths about us as was required to render our position intelligible. 2 reasons for this restricted course readily suggest themselves. In the first place, it is unworthy of history to indulge in general eulogium, and not have the facts, the demonstration of which we undertake to show. And in the second place, the times in which I have written were so pregnant with tangible, prominent events that they carried with them plainly the lives and principles of those who acted in them. Now, however, as we approach the last campaign of the Confederate War, we find the circumstances of the South moral and material so greatly changed from what they were even a 12th month before, that it is necessary to describe not only the Army of Northern Virginia, but the whole of the Confederacy, and not only the actions of our command, but its frame of mind, in order to form any conception whatever of what we were. In the Trans-Mississippi, the year 1864 had opened auspiciously for the Confederate arms. The only formidable force in the enemy there had been defeated and demoralized by Kirby Smith in the early spring, and there seemed for a time to be fair prospect of the deliverance of that whole department. But the expedition of Price to Missouri dragged through the summer, and ended without anything being accomplished. And finally, the utter hopelessness of assistance from that half of the Confederacy was settled by the refusal of Smith's army to cross the Mississippi and reinforce Hood. So there you have somebody in the Army of Northern Virginia who's like, if you cooperated better, then maybe we wouldn't be in this mess right now. So it's a little bit of hindsight there, but obviously Kirby Smith likes his independent command. If he had moved his army across the river, it probably would not have ended up like this guy is saying. There would have been a mass desertion, and there probably wouldn't have been a whole lot of troops that actually would have made it to Hood. The northern portions of Mississippi and Alabama had been somewhat defended through the brilliant exertions of Forrest, and 2 or 3 important raids had been made into Tennessee and Kentucky. But fierce battles with immensely superior numbers and the various hardships of service had worn down that general's command to a mere handful who achieved sufficient in maintaining any hold whatever between the Tennessee River and the Gulf of Mexico. So the account actually goes on and talks about different areas of the Confederacy, where kind of gives a little bit of a recap there. Also talks about just the general, probably low morale, shall we say, for the civilian population. But we're going to flip ahead just a little bit and cover into what actually the brigade is doing. The men were required to keep on their accoutrements and remain in the pits at all time. At night, at least one man in every pit was required to be awake, with his rifle in hand. As a general rule, a third or half of our men were allowed to sleep. Officers usually threw their details together so as to divide the night between them and get half a night's rest. But there was little rest to be had, for we lay on a perfectly bare ridge swept by every wind, and we could get wood with only the greatest difficulty. Long before the winter passed, we cut every tree between the picket line and the breastworks, and we finally to haul wood from a considerable distance in the rear of the army. There was a growth of small pines between the greater part of our brigade line and the enemy. These were cut somewhat, but they ran so much nearer the enemy usually that we had to manage very carefully to prevent a collision. I remember once taking a party under my command at the very vedette line of the Federals, where we cut wood and carried it off. Occasionally a Federal officer would object to this, and once we were informed that future woodcutters would be fired upon. So remember we talked about how sometimes in these cases of siege and the lines are so close together, especially with your earthwork lines, there's kind of an unwritten rule about not firing upon one another, but when firewood is so scarce, then that's going to go out the window. Preparations were made by us the next day to test the matter, but the objections were withdrawn and we had no fight. This picket was very hard duty, for wind, rain, and snow, sleet had to be met without a particle of shelter, and with the scanty supply of wood I have just spoken of, an enlisted man's turn came about every 4th day. I frequently locked the whole night to keep from freezing. The sharpshooters of the brigade perform the brigade picket every 3rd or 4th day as a rule. These perform the only active service done on the picket line, by several times charging the Federal picket. I have before had occasion to express a high opinion of our sharpshooters, but I am constrained more than ever to do so in this connection. When a few prisoners were wanted, and they were sometimes our only chance of information for the enemy's movements, General Wilcox would order one or more of his battalion of sharpshooters to capture some. I think our battalion generally operated with Lane's battalion. They would move out of our picket line a little before day, creep close to the enemy, rush in, generally by the flank, and sweep up and down the works. They always captured some prisoners and a good deal of plunder, and sometimes killed a few of the enemy, but I never heard of a single casualty among them. At dawn they would return to our lines. To execute such a movement as to this often as they did, and never lose a man, is the very evidence of good drill, discipline, and courage. The other important employment of our brigade was entrenching. We not only erected a strong line of works in our front, but we assisted in throwing up powerful field fortifications some 2 miles below our camp. For nearly 2 months, a detail varying from 200 to 350 men was constantly at work here, except on Sunday from 8 o'clock to 4 p.m. These works were constructed according to rule, with a ditch in front of 6 feet depth, 8 feet width. Hence all the earth for the embankment was thrown, with an embankment of 6 feet height, 12 feet base, and 4 feet terraplane, with a strong and neat revetment and a banquette tread. These works would conceal troops marching behind them. They would afford perfect protection from small arms and ordinary field artillery fire, and they could scarcely be stormed, on account of the ditch and the brush abattis in front. This was hard work, for we had to walk at least 2 miles over ground almost always either shoe deep in mud or frozen hard and rough, and we had to dig up earth, frequently frozen to the depth of a foot, and at other times running streams of water. It was at this work that I had the strongest evidence of the exhaustion of the troops. Some men dug and shoveled well, but the majority, even those who looked strong and healthy, would pant and grow faint under the labor of half an hour. This was most strikingly the case when our meat ration failed. A pint of cornmeal could hardly keep men hearty in the winter. Each man's turn came every third or fourth day for this work. Now we experienced a great suffering for food and clothing than we had ever done before. The ration of food professed to be a pound of cornmeal and a third of a pound of bacon, but we received scarcely the full weight of the former, and the latter we had frequently to do without entirely. I am not mistaken, we had no meat for a whole week once. The most pitiful ships were employed to produce us meat. Canned beef, imported from England, was issued a few times, and at other times small bits of poor blue beef were doled out. Sometimes we had coffee, and now and then a spoonful of sugar. Tobacco of the worst quality was issued every month, at the rate of a fourth of a pound to a man. Each officer had one ration given him now, just as enlisted men. Once we had half a gill of whiskey issued to each man. It was amusing as well as sad to see the delight of the troops over this drop of comfort. All this time the enemy drank coffee, ate fat, fresh beef, and good bread, and drank quantities of whiskey till their roarings at night testified. Clothing was sparsely issued, and what we received was coarse and flimsy. I do not remember the issue of a single overcoat, and but a few blankets. Shoes were scarce. More than once a soldier left a bloody track on the frozen picket line. We suffered for firewood. The growth about the camp, never heavy, was soon consumed by the troops, and for the last 2 months of our stay we were obliged to carry logs on our shoulders for the distance of a mile or more in order to have any fire at all. What we did get was the most generally green pine or swamp wood. General McGowan set the wagons of the brigade to hauling wood for us during the latter part of the winter, but the distance of the wood from the camp, the roughness of the roads, the small number of wagons we had, and the wretched condition of the teams prevented us from receiving anything beyond the merest apology for fuel. We drilled very little, and what we did not was creditable. The truth is, the men were worn out in mind and in body, and every effort had become painfully irksome. The unpleasant question of desertion presents itself very naturally in this connection. I am not disposed to shirk it, however, or even to smooth it over. There probably never was a collection of men numbering as many as 100 in which there was not to be found one bad person. How extremely unreasonable then could it be to imagine that every soldier of a brigade could be a hero? We had those who were quite a reverse, I'm free to acknowledge. The first desertion I can remember was a soldier in the 1st Regiment, who was soon followed by another of that regiment. Then 9 men of Orr's regiment of rifles left us. Then 1 or 2 men of the 12th Regiment deserted. One of them, one of those 2 deserters who were convicted at Orange Courthouse and pardoned. 3 or 4 deserted from the 14th Regiment. Finally, 26 men of the 13th Regiment marched from their posts on the picket line at a signal. All of these went to the enemy. The last party were fired upon by their comrades, but I do not know whether with any effect. 11 men of the 1st Regiment quitted the camp in early part of March and started for home. But 5 of them were captured next morning and brought back to us. They were tried before the corps, court-martialed sentenced, and 4 of them shot the following day. The 5th was respited, on account of his youth and the temptation supposed to have been offered him by the rest. It was a sad spectacle, and its sadness was increased by the fact that one of these 4 had an excellent soldier, and borne that day scars of 3 wounds received in battle. The whole number of deserters in the brigade reached 104. We looked our condition in the face, and we saw that the war was rapidly drawing to an issue before or less disastrous to us. The conviction everywhere prevailed that we could sustain but one more campaign. The most skeptical gave us until October to maintain ourselves. I thought we should see the close about July. Others said as early a date as May. We were not confident that the Confederacy would be subjugated, for there was at least a possibility of interference in our behalf by that mysterious providence we had been taught to trust, or by almost equally mysterious powers of Europe, which we should have been taught never to trust. But wherever the end was to be, and wherever it was come, sooner or late, we knew that our duty was to stand to our arms and fight the battle through. Therefore, though we were cold and ragged and hungry, though we were abandoned by that country for which we had suffered so long and so terribly, though thousands of the enemy held high revel before us, waking the echoes far and near with shoutings and the strains of bands and bugles, we lay in grim repose, and expected the renewal of the mortal conflict. And then he actually ends the account here with a little bit of a line from the Charge of the Light Brigade. There is not to make reply. There is not to reason why. There is but to do or die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. So really like a very grim view of the situation that's in the entrenchments around Petersburg, around Richmond, right? Obviously, it highlights very well how picked over and clean the countryside is. That's the problem with continued campaigning in these places like Virginia and Tennessee, is that there's not going to be as much forage for food. There's not going to be as much firewood, right? We're looking for firewood. We're having to go a long way to get it. Whereas if you're the Union Army, you probably are better able to find it. And you also have this account of desertions. And that's going to be a problem for Robert E. Lee as we get in here into the actual campaigning season. He's going to have a problem with actually trying to get his army to the point where they're not deserting. So that is something we should earmark, and then we'll cover that here in a future episode. But I think we're going to actually pull it up right there. We had two different accounts, two primary sources of what life was like here at the close of the war for the two different sides. There's you kind of get the tone, even very sharp contrast between the Union Army and the Confederate Army. And we do need to, so hopefully that was a good view and a nice kind of depiction of the two sides for you. Next week, though, we will have a packed episode. We need to talk about William T. Sherman and his actions since reaching the sea. We also need to talk about the 13th Amendment and Frederick Douglass. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.